All right, I'm here with Ibrahim Hindy. He is with the Dar Al-Tawheed Mosque here in Mississauga, and he's my special guest today. I really appreciate him being here with us. Thank you very much, Ibrahim, for joining us. I've been working for the last few weeks trying to find an imam that would come in and help us out, and he's been working at the mosque for how long now?
I've been involved in the mosque for more than 10 years.
Okay.
I've been working there for a couple of years.
Great. Well, we really appreciate you being here. I want it to be clear to all of our viewers that no one person can speak for a faith as large as Christianity or Islam. So what we're having here today is a perspective that's going to help us, but both of our faiths are very diverse. This is designed to be an interview and not a debate, so we're not going to be going back and forth. I'm not going to press Ibrahim here on his answers. From time to time, if there's some little clarification that I'm looking for, I may ask for that. But if we want to do a debate, we can do that at a different time. But anyway, we'll jump right into it here. We're going to go by theme, so I thought we would start kind of where it's logical to start, and we would begin by talking about Allah. So my first question, Ibrahim, is who is Allah, and how does he compare to the God of the Bible?
So there's different opinions on how linguistically this word Allah came about to being. The strongest opinion linguistically is that it's an amalgamation between El. So El in Arabic is the definitive article, meaning the, and Ilah means God. And so it's the amalgamation meaning the God, or the greatest God, meaning the one that created the heavens and the earth. So the pre-Islamic Arabs believed in different idols. They had different entities that they worshipped. Those were called like small ilahs or idols. But they still believed, similar to present-day Hinduism, where they have different gods that they believe in, but they still believe that there's one God who created all things, that has power over all things. So that was what they referred to as Allah. So really, in a very basic sense, Allah just means God. And if you were to go to a Muslim country that has a Christian minority, go into a church and pick up a Bible in Arabic and open it, it would say Allah, because it's how, just linguistically, that's how you would call God. Okay,
good. The Bible says that God is love. In other words, it's a defining aspect of his character, and God and love really cannot be separated. Everything he does is out of love. How does that compare in terms of how Muslims would understand Allah? Is Allah love? Is he defined that way? Does he love every person?
So in Islam we have 99, we'll see God has 99 attributes that they're, for instance, God is the most powerful, God is the most forgiving, God is the most, the everlasting, the one who has no beginning, no end, etc. But there is one defining attribute, I would say, that is the most mentioned attribute of God throughout the Quran. That every time we recite any chapter in the Quran, we begin by mentioning God's name and this attribute, and that attribute is his attribute of mercy. And so one of the verses in the Quran says, وَرَحْمَتِي وَسِعَتْ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ, that God says, my mercy has overwhelmed or encompassed all things. And so we really believe that God's mercy is the one attribute that defines him the most. We also believe that God has, two of his attributes, Rahman, Rahim, both of them mean mercy. One of them means that he is merciful in general, meaning that God is merciful to all of his creation. He has this mercy for all of his creation. And that he has specific mercy for those who are especially pure and righteous, like the prophets and the righteous people.
Okay, good. All right, let's move on to Muhammad and Jesus. From what history tells us, there seem to be significant differences between Muhammad and Jesus. Jesus, we know, was a very peaceful person. Most of his first followers were willingly martyred, kind of following in his pattern. But sources are pretty consistent that Muhammad was sometimes a man of war. He expanded the Muslim faith, at least early on, through force and sometimes bloodshed. How do Muslims view that? How do they explain that? Kind of give me your perspective.
Sure. So this is one of those major misconceptions that we feel exist out there. And we consider that it's mostly taken out of context. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was, prophethood was revealed to him until he died. It was 23 years. 13 of those years he lived in persecution. And he and his followers were being persecuted, tortured, some of them killed through torture. And during that time, they didn't lift a finger in self-defense. And even in that time, some of the companions of the Prophet would come to him complaining about the torture that they were facing. And he would remind them of the followers of Jesus. And he would tell them, look at what they faced and the punishment they faced, and they remained patient. So they're ordered to remain patient. And all of the verses of war that come later, all of them are revealed out of this context. And the first verse of war that is revealed in the Quran that speaks about war says, permission has been granted to fight because you have been oppressed. So it's because of that persecution and oppression that they were allowed to fight in order to defend themselves. And we see that all of, this is obviously a much larger subject, but we view that all of the battles that the Prophet fought in his life, all of them were out of self-defense. All of them was him defending his faith and the ability to preach his faith from his enemies who wanted him exterminated.
Okay. Muslims claim to revere Jesus, or Isa, agreeing that he was a prophet, and a lot of Christians are actually surprised to find out how much Muslims agree with, the person of Jesus and historically some of these things. You guys would agree that he was a prophet, virgin-born, and a performer of miracles? That's true? Okay. The Quran even says that he is coming back to earth someday. How can Muslims revere Jesus as a prophet of Allah? This is kind of the question here. When he himself, we believe, claimed to be God, and when we look at the Bible, there's pretty clear claims that he was claiming to be divine or to be God. So how do Muslims still revere him as a prophet when he seemed to be claiming to be God?
So obviously from our perspective is that we would say we don't believe that he claimed to be God. Okay. So the Quran makes reference to the past scriptures being changed at certain points. And so most Muslims will point to that, say that many of these verses that Jesus claimed divinity must have been added in at some point. There are also secular scholars who make this argument as well. Obviously, you're not going to agree with me on this point. One of those points we're not going to agree on, but that's generally how we view it. Okay. So we view him as being one of the prophets that God has sent throughout history, okay. And his prophethood is a bit different because he's the Messiah.
Okay. What does that mean, Messiah?
For us, it means that he's going to be the one who fulfills his destiny to come back in the end of times and to have what you would call the kingdom of heaven.
Okay.
And everyone would believe in the true religion on that day.
Okay. All right, well, let's move on to the Quran. We've kind of touched on it a little bit here, so it's kind of a natural moving point here. The Bible was written by about 40 different people over a period of roughly around 1,600 years. Most scholars would agree with that. Tell us about the Quran. How was it written? Give us a little bit of history.
Sure. So the Quran we believe was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, sometimes directly from God, often through the angel Gabriel to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and he transmitted it to the people orally. And the Arabs were generally Bedouin people, and their tradition was an oral tradition. There were a few people who could read and write. So even their pre-Islamic poetry and history, they would recite this off of memory. So most of them memorized the Quran, but also some of them, the few that could read and write, they would write it down as well. They would write it on parchments of paper, hides of leather, things like that, whatever they could write. After the Prophet passed away, a year after, the companions of the Prophet decided they needed to amalgamate this into a copy. So they gathered together, there was a project to gather together all of these manuscripts, all of these little scraps of paper, and to have people claim testimony that they heard these verses directly from the Prophet and that they had a witness with them, and that's how they essentially compiled it into the book.
Okay, good. The Quran in Surah 4, 157, I'm not an expert in this, I looked this up. It says that Jesus was not crucified, but someone who looked like him. That seems to be what it's saying there. You can clarify that if it's not so. What historical evidence did Muhammad draw upon to conclude that Jesus was not crucified?
Sure. So the verse, as it states, it says that he was not killed, nor was he crucified, but rather it was made to seem to them. Right. So there is no historical evidence to support this. Okay. And that's intrinsic in the verse itself, as the verse is saying it was made to seem. People all thought that he was crucified because that's what was made to seem to them. Okay. But there was a secret, in fact, that he was in some way saved by God. How was he saved? There really isn't anything authoritative in the religion that speaks about this. Okay. Again, like I said, the Arabs wouldn't have even been concerned to ask, was he crucified, was he not? It really wouldn't have made a difference for them. But this, as we dig deeper into the tradition, the reason why this is important, why this verse it has relevance, is because, so in the Old Testament, the Messiah is described as being blessed. In the Old Scriptures, it's described as being blessed. In the Quran, the first miracle that is attributed to Jesus is him speaking as a baby and defending the honor of his mother. And one of the first things he says is, وَجَعَلَنِي مُبَارَكًا, God made me blessed. So he became, like he's saying that God has made me blessed. And this is the attribute of the Messiah is blessed. The enemies of Jesus wanted him to be crucified because crucifixion in the old scripture was considered a mark of someone who was cursed. Mm-hmm. So if they can make him crucified, then they can turn to the people and say what you want about Jesus. He's a good guy, he's righteous, even he performs miracles, fine, but you can't say he's the Messiah because he's crucified. And crucifixion means you're cursed. Crucifixion means, by definition, you're not blessed.
Okay.
So the Quran is saying that he's not killed and he's not crucified, meaning that they haven't eliminated his attribute of being blessed, and that he is the Messiah and he will return, and through him God will establish the kingdom of heaven on earth, as you would call it.
That's interesting, because in Christian faith, we look back to the Old Testament, and it does say, cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. So that curse is there. And we actually believe as Christians that Jesus allowed himself to become cursed for us in dying on the cross. So that's interesting. Okay. All right, well, let's keep moving on. We're moving now into kind of a touchy area. We're going to talk about violence and terrorism and so on. And again, here in this section, we're asking for you to kind of give us some insight maybe that we wouldn't have. Not because this is anything associated with you or your mosque. So I appreciate your patience with this. The Quran uses the term infidel. It's there quite a lot. What is an infidel, and how is a Muslim supposed to treat one?
So I would disagree that the word infidel doesn't show up in the Quran. Primarily, it's not an Arabic word.
Right.
So the word that exists in the Quran is kafir.
Okay.
And the way that I was always taught, and the way that we always interpreted it and translated it to ourselves as since I was a child, was it means non-Muslim or it means disbeliever.
Okay.
And actually, if you look back at the history of the word infidel, it was really something used in European history. The Crusaders used it, people used it at different times. And so somehow when Europeans began to read the Quran, they kind of transposed this meaning onto the word kafir.
Okay. And it is kind of a loaded term.
It is a loaded term for sure. So from our perspective, it just means disbeliever. Okay. Sometimes there are verses that are very harsh about the disbelievers, right? But we interpret them as these verses are speaking about the specific disbelievers who persecuted the Muslims and drove them out of their homes, and that's why it's speaking about them. There is another verse in the Quran that says about the disbelievers, about the kuffar, that if they don't drive you out of their homes and they don't shed your blood unjustly, then you need to treat them fairly and mercifully, kindly. Okay. This is in the Quran. So the Quran clearly is making a distinction between different kinds of disbelievers. Not all the disbelievers are the same. The ones who fight you and kill you are not the same like the ones who are peaceful. Okay. So that distinction is there. And we also believe that ultimately the judgment is for God alone. So if I see someone, you can say this is a disbeliever, doesn't believe in Islam, and everything about them is evil, I can't say they're going to hellfire. Right. This is actually an essential creedal point in the Sunni tradition. Okay. Maybe some Sunnis aren't even aware of it, unfortunately. Likewise, if I see someone who is righteous, who goes to the mosque, who does everything good, I can't say they're going to heaven. Right? The judgment is for God alone.
Yeah. Christians would agree with that too. Okay. Next question. As Christians, we understand the whole sectarianism thing. We have tons of different denominations within the Christian faith. And we also understand the lunatic fringe, that there's always going to be in any faith kind of that fringe element that really doesn't represent the larger group, that kind of are extremists. There is, however, a perception in North America that Muslims in general are slow to condemn acts of violence that are committed by these radical Muslims. And I've heard that many times. People in Canada or even Christians that say, yeah, I understand that there's a lunatic kind of fringe group that's doing this, but how come the others don't seem to speak out against it? That's a perception. So I'm going to let you kind of speak to that perception a little bit. Is it accurate? Why or why not?
Sure. So first of all, just to, side note kind of thing, I actually agree that these kinds of discussions are actually so fruitful because I feel like other faith communities understand faith dynamics better than other people, right? So you can understand some of these dynamics better for sure. So for the average Muslim, especially here in North America, they don't understand why people can't hear them condemn these acts of terrorism. And every single Muslim institution throughout the world, and especially in North America, have vehemently, repeatedly condemned these acts of terrorism. Go on their websites, you're always going to see them. For some reason, even if the person does somehow read them or come across them, they don't really think much of them for some reason or another. Usually they don't even come across them, and often you hear in the media people are asking, why aren't they condemning it? We are condemning it. We're constantly doing it, and somehow it's not being heard. Okay. I think this is partly a function of, for example, I'm a second generation Canadian. Yeah. My parents came here as immigrants. They really had laser focus on getting a job, providing for their family, kind of establishing themselves here. They really didn't have time as a community to build relationships with other community groups, faith groups, and things like that. So we don't have that megaphone that other communities do. So when we're speaking, no one's really hearing us.
Okay.
And from a media perspective, whenever ISIS says something, that's exciting and terrifying. It's good to tell people you're going to get ratings off of that. When we speak, it's not really something that's exciting and going to get ratings. So they kind of tend to dismiss it or overlook it. So we do have this problem. I will tell people to go into a website called lettertobaghdadi.com.
Okay.
And this is a detailed, 50-page, 100-page refutation of the leader of ISIS, point by point. And it's signed by literally every Muslim scholar of notoriety throughout the Muslim world who don't agree on anything, but somehow they're able to agree on this, and all of their names are there on that website. So I point people to
That's worthwhile checking out. Okay, good clarification, thank you. Help us understand why these radical Muslims, again, not you, there seems to be this hatred for America and even its allies. So much that they obviously feel justified in using violence and terrorism at certain points. Don't be shy on this. Try to help us understand, because here in Canada we are fed a fairly, Americanized, version of the story. Try to help us understand where that sort of animosity would come from against America, if you can.
So, first of all, and I'll say this repeatedly as I answer this, I don't want to provide any justification for their actions. Their actions are evil, they're wrong, there is no justification in our religion for the things that they do. Okay. So I want to constantly say that because I don't want to, come off as making excuses for them or justifying them in any way. I appreciate that. So for sure, the average Muslim who lives in a Muslim country has a completely different perception of the United States and the West in general. I would say probably the main point, because obviously we could talk about this forever, right? Yeah. But I would say the main point is the average Muslim who lives in the average Muslim country, because not all Muslim countries are the same or have the same history. Countries like Senegal or Malaysia don't really have much dislike for America because their history is different. Yeah. But the average Muslim living in the average Muslim country, they most likely live under a very repressive regime, a very tyrannical regime. And most of those regimes, if not all of them, are supported materially by the United States. And those are for different geopolitical reasons. The US sees that these repressive regimes are supporting them geopolitically for their strategy in some way or another. So those support these regimes. So the average Muslim living in the average country is saying, I'm seeing my country deteriorate year by year, decade by decade, it's getting worse. And I have no agency over my country because this government is imposed upon me by the United States. They're supporting them through military aid, they're supporting them through a variety of means. So they tend to basically transpose all of the grievances they have in their own countries, their own situation, onto the United States because of this reality that they see their rulers as being kind of patrons to the United States. So I would say this is the essential point, beyond any other point. Likewise, we don't see necessarily all of the things that happen in Muslim countries that they're not relayed to us through the media. So for instance, the drone strike program that President Obama has really expanded, 99% of the people that it kills are completely innocent people. So when that happens, it's obviously, things that it doesn't even come up on our headlines or anything, right? It's just kind of like in the back pages of newspapers, it makes it there at all. But there they see it and they're talking about it, kind of the same way we talk about some of the major incidents that happen here, they're talking about those incidents. So those kind of things add fuel to this kind of growing disparity and kind of like how we see each other. And then the reality is nobody wants to take responsibility for colonialism, but there are effects of that still remain till today. Most of the Muslim countries, literally, there was French and German and British people sitting down, drawing out on a map. Okay, this country's going to look like this, and this country's going to look like that.
Never a good scenario.
And so a lot of these states are now failed states. Right? Like Syria is basically a failed state. Iraq's a failed state. Yemen is a failed state. And the reality is their borders were created by Europeans who drew out their borders for their own purposes, and because of that, and the cynical person would say they did this on purpose in order to make sure that these countries were weak. So, the effects of colonialism have also kind of stayed there, and people tend to transpose that onto the United States as the one that's carrying the flag for colonialism. Again, not providing justification for in any way whatsoever.
No, well spoken. Ibrahim has a background in history, so you do a good job at covering that. All right, let's move to the topic of women. This tends to be another one of the hot button issues. One of the first things that Westerners notice about Islam is the fact that women wear a veil or some kind of head covering. Tell us about why Muslim women wear a hijab or a niqab, and what does that represent?
Sure. So the niqab is kind of an esoteric tradition. Most Muslims don't practice it, or most Muslim scholarship kind of don't regard it in the same way. So there's a lot of differences when it comes to niqab. So let's put that aside. Hijab is obviously something that is very commonly worn by Muslim women. What is the reason for it? It's an act of devotion to God. So they're devoting themselves to God, and this is an act of devotion that God has enjoined upon women. Like any act of devotion, God tells us to give charity or to pray. We're always going to look for wisdom behind it. What's the wisdom of charity? Well, you increase the mercy in your heart for others. Poor people and rich people in the society get closer together. So, there's wisdoms that we read into it. So what's the wisdom of a woman wearing a head veil? We would say, she grows her modesty. Her modesty increases through this act of devotion to God.
Now, there are a couple of verses in the Quran that seem to condone something that we would find very difficult, and that is a man striking his wife under certain circumstances. So, Surah 434, 38, 44, there seems to be allusion to that. How are those passages to be understood?
Sure. So it's only really the one passage,
434. Okay.
So that's the one that I would say is problematic in that sometimes people do take it out of context.
Okay.
So this verse, let's kind of, how do we interpret the Quran?
Yeah.
Right? Let's go back to the basics or the principle. We interpret the Quran based on what the Prophet said and did, and we also interpret the Quran based on how the earliest Muslims understood it. Okay. Right? So this verse talks about, when there's marital discourse, that the husband should leave the bed, abandon the wife in the bed for a while. If that doesn't work, then it says strike her. And if that doesn't work, then to go for divorce. Okay. Essentially, is what the verse says. So some people have, I'll say, like more of a liberal understanding of this reinterpretation of this verse, or interpretation is they'll say the word for strike in Arabic could mean to take a path, like to strike a path. Okay. So they'll say this is saying to leave, like both of them are saying to leave. I don't really ascribe to that. Okay. I do think it says to strike. However, how did the early Muslims understand this? Okay. So I go back to the earliest Muslims. All of them said it means to hit the person with a twig. Okay. Literally a small twig or like a pen or something. You hit the person with a pen. So now someone could say, well, why would you do that? What's the wisdom of that? How does that make any sense? So the way that I look at it and the way that I preach about it is that this verse is talking about, and I'm sure you have a lot of experience with this, where you have married couples and they're having problems and they're not really communicating, and all of a sudden one side says, I want a divorce. And the other side's like, whoa, where did that come from? I didn't expect that to happen, right? Yeah. So really it's a situation where there's a breakdown of communication. One side doesn't understand how bad it's getting for the other side. Okay. So this verse is about when that verbal communication breaks down, you need to still communicate in other ways. So one way to communicate is you leave the bed. Mm-hmm. So that way the wife knows, hey, this is really getting to a point where he's even willing to leave me in the bed and sleep somewhere else. Yeah. And if that doesn't work, then you tap the person. And this is a type of nonverbal communication, this striking with a pen or with a twig to say, this has reached its limits. Like I don't have any other avenue after this other than divorce. Okay. And if that still doesn't work, then you get the divorce of that part. Okay. So that's how I understand the verse, and that's how I would say the majority of Muslims do understand the verse. Unfortunately, there are some Muslims, and domestic violence is a problem in all cultures, in all countries. In this country, you can see the statistics are terrible, same in the United States. But unfortunately, and the same problem, I'm sure the statistics are consistent in the Muslim world as well. And unfortunately, some Muslims probably are prone to beat their wives anyways, but then after they do it, they'll point to this verse. And so I have an extra obligation to always clarify that this verse does not condone domestic violence in any way. Okay,
good. Thank you for that. All right, let's move to the concepts of kingdom and caliphate. The Bible teaches that Jesus started his kingdom when he came, and his kingdom was this invisible kingdom that really exists in people's hearts when they give their devotion to God and to Jesus. It's a non-physical, non-political kind of kingdom that he described. And it really fooled a lot of the people in his day that were expecting him to come as a king and to set up a kingdom. So that's kind of the version that we see in the New Testament. Describe the Islamic concept of caliphate, which would be kind of the closest sort of concept maybe to kingdom or what God is trying to establish.
Sure. So the caliphate is one of these hot-button issues these days. Let's go back to the root of it. So the word caliphate literally means successor. Okay. So when the Prophet passed away and the first leader was elected, he was called Khalifat Rasulullah, the successor of the Messenger of God. Okay. When he passed away and another person took control, he was called Khalifat Rasulullah, the successor of the successor
Okay.
of the Prophet.
That gets really long after a while.
Yeah, exactly. So that's all it means is successor.
Okay.
In the Quran, actually, the word caliphate in the way that we understand it doesn't even exist.
Okay.
The only verse that says Khalifa is referring to humans as being successors, meaning that we have children and they succeed us.
Okay.
That's the only mention of caliphate
Interesting.
throughout the entire Quran. Now, there are general principles that the Prophet kind of speaks about with regards to the caliphate, but generally it's left open.
Okay.
Because it's left open, it's become this slogan that radical groups sometimes grab hold of and run with. And also you have to understand that for most Muslims, the early part of Islam, when there was righteous followers of the Prophet who were caliphs, and they had this title of caliphs, they ruled with justice and equity and fairness and things like that. So Muslims tend to look to that era and be like, that's the ideal governorship when people were just and righteous and things like that. So, but the term, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, didn't even appoint his own successor. And we feel that that was on purpose because he's kind of leaving it open for us in terms of how we decide to govern ourselves.
Okay.
Right? If he said this is the way, or this is the leader, this is the way to do it, then we would be restricted to whatever he said. He left it open-ended. It's good and bad. Right? It's good because I feel we could adopt different governmental systems that work for us, whereas it's bad because you get these radical groups trying to transpose their own definition of what caliphate means and running with that.
Freedom always has a cost to it. Right? Yeah. Okay. Do most Muslims believe in democracy or theocracy, which would be more of a religious state?
Sure. So I would say that, really in a way we probably don't go for either.
Okay.
If I had to choose one, I'd probably choose democracy.
Okay.
As amazing as that sounds.
Okay.
The reason is because the early caliphs, when they were choosing the next caliph, they would actually knock on everyone's door, ask them, who do you think should be the leader? They even went to the housewives and even the school children and asked them, who do you think should be the next leader? So they kind of consulted everyone. And this is a principle in Islam and a principle in the Quran. The believers are those who consult one another. It's a verse.
Okay.
So they have to, this mutual consultation is one of the principles we would say of Islamic governorship.
Okay.
Really what we would say is that there are certain religious principles that whoever is ruling needs to abide by, right? So whoever the caliph is, they need to abide by certain religious principles, such as justice, fairness, mercy.
Would Muslims then be in favor of the separation of church and state? Is that going too far, or how would you?
So we get this question a lot, and it's the problem is, I'd say for the average Muslim, this question doesn't even make sense to them.
Okay.
And the reason is because we have this completely different history. So we kind of have to study like the history of the average European versus the average Middle Easterner.
Yeah.
We do have, like the Prophet, peace be upon him, used to always, there's many oral traditions from him saying to the people of knowledge, so like religious clergy and scholarship, not to be at the doors of the rulers. Don't go to the doors of the rulers. One of them says, when you do so, you've sold your religion for something that's worse, things like that. So the Prophet preached independence from religious clergy from political authority.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that political authority shouldn't be acting based on general religious principles.
Okay. What is Sharia law? We hear about it a lot. We know that even here in Ontario, going back 10 or 15 years, there was kind of a movement to try to, in certain areas, to have Sharia law instituted. Explain what that is to us.
So it's kind of like, explain history. Right?
Yeah.
It's like this huge topic. So Sharia is, like, linguistically, it means a path.
Okay.
So Sharia is the path towards God.
Okay.
So I know sometimes people will be like, good Muslims don't believe in Sharia and bad Muslims believe in Sharia and stuff like that. And we're like, but Sharia is everything, like prayer, fasting, charity, everything's considered.
It's a way of life.
Exactly, right?
Okay.
So if you tell someone, do you believe in Sharia? Every Muslim's going to say, yeah, obviously, right? But one Muslim's definition of Sharia is going to be very different than another Muslim's definition of Sharia. What one person thinks is obligatory or prohibited is going to be different from what another person does. So there's a huge diversity of interpretation.
So here in Ontario, when they were kind of talking about that, would there be, though, a kind of a set, understood body of beliefs or traditions that would include, that most people would understand?
So that was actually one of the criticisms that Muslims had to that, was that, in theory, it doesn't make, it's fine if you have people seeking mutual arbitration or based on general Sharia principles, but there are so many different Sharia opinions. Like, which one are you going to choose, right? So from that perspective, it didn't seem that pragmatic, even when that situation came up in the past. So Sharia is something that's, is basically our deriving rules from the scripture.
Yeah.
And the way that you do that, the principles you use differ from different Muslims, and the conclusions that you draw out of it differ for different Muslims. And it's really not that different than, I would say, like canon law. In the Jewish faith, they have something called halakha, which ironically, linguistically, also means Sharia, means the way.
Okay.
So we have like very similar understanding, perception of that as well.
Okay.
I would, want to mention one of he's considered a very conservative Muslim scholar in the 14th century. He had a very beautiful quote. He said, Sharia, all of it is wisdom, all of it is justice, all of it is mercy. So if it ever takes you from wisdom to foolishness, or from mercy to cruelty, or from justice to injustice, then it's not Sharia, even if people claim it to be. And the reality is most people, when they talk about Sharia, they're talking about medieval laws. So there's these books with medieval laws where people in the past, in medieval times, interpreted the scripture based on medieval times that they lived in. So they had these medieval laws. And they say we need to take these medieval laws and apply them to today. And I would say the majority of Muslim scholars completely reject this. And they would say it needs to be reinterpreted based on our own modern life.
Okay. Let me give you a follow-up question to that, because this is one that kind of, I think, hangs in a lot of Canadians' minds. Is the goal of Islam to see Canada become an Islamic state? And if it ever did, what would that look like for someone like me who's non-Muslim?
Sure. So
again, I appreciate your graciousness.
No, and I appreciate the question because I do go online and I read people talking about this.
Yeah.
There's like all these conspiracy theories about Muslims taking over the country, and to me, actually, it's like those are one of the questions that make me almost afraid because it feels to me like this anti-Muslim rhetoric sometimes getting out of hand. Because it's not that unsimilar to what people were saying about the Jews prior to the Holocaust. Like they were saying, they're conspiring to take over the world and things like that, even though they were such a small minority. And so to think that 2% of Canada, or even less of Muslims here in Canada, are going to take over the country, it seems like it's just this fantastical kind of interpretation.
Well, people would say for now it seems like that, but we know that the rate, if we follow the trajectory, right, they can see it happening.
I think a few thousand years.
It could take a while. Yeah, sure.
I don't agree with that whatsoever.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm in this country, and I think all Muslims, I've never heard of Muslims say, yeah, we got to turn Canada into unless they think there's a bad joke or something. I've never heard any Muslims seriously in Canada say we got to turn Canada into an Islamic state.
Okay. So if Canada ever did become an Islamic state, what would that mean for someone like me?
So
if I wasn't practicing,
if you somehow landed into an Islamic state somewhere,
well, if it ever, just say it ever happened that in Canada, because I've seen statistics by 2050. There's projections that Islam will overtake Christianity as the largest faith in the world. Whether or not that happens, but just say it was to ever happen in Canada or in any other country where it became an Islamic state, what would that mean for someone that wasn't practicing the Islamic faith? Would I be okay to continue to practice my faith? Would there be penalties for that?
So let me answer 2 parts.
Okay.
So one part of the question is, I know everyone talks about the birth rates and it's like causing this alarm. For sure, birth rates amongst Muslims is higher. Western people tend to have, they want a higher standard of living for their kids, so they tend to have fewer kids. However, when Muslims come to this country and settle here, and they're second generation, third generation, they tend to also start adopting the practices of having lesser kids as well, right? So
I've got 4 kids. How many do you have?
I have 2.
You gotta catch up now. Just messing with you.
Yeah. So this idea that these rates are going to continue the way that they are until we outnumber them, I don't think that's reasonable. I think as Muslims establish themselves in this country, they're going to kind of take on cultural norms of the country and have those kids.
Yeah.
But I'll answer the other question. Under this conception of the Muslim state, what happens to non-Muslim minorities? I know that's an important question, right? In the time of the Prophet, the way he set up their community, there was a shared constitution between the Muslims of Medina. All of the different religious groups shared a constitution that they agreed upon and signed. And he gave all religious minorities their own ability to judge between themselves.
Okay.
So Christians would deal with their own problems within their own Christian minority.
Okay.
So the Islamic government, quote unquote, didn't have authority over the majority of affairs between Christians or between Jews. They would be governed by themselves. Okay. And this is a practice even till today kind of exists in some Muslim countries, like in Egypt, issues of like marriage, divorce, whatever. It doesn't go to secular courts.
Okay.
They'll leave it to like the Christian minority will judge themselves,
okay.
and the Muslims will judge themselves. So that's kind of the conception that the Prophet instituted. that existed. So he had tremendous freedom for different religions. But the religions would basically be a state within the state. So they would judge themselves within that state.
Okay.
However, for bigger issues that had to deal with everyone, issues of war, then the Christians would either need to contribute financially or physically, either one,
Okay.
in order to defend everyone. So their shared, concerns and safety.
Okay. I understand. Those are very complex issues, and
Yeah.
like you say, a lot of it is kind of theoretical still.
For
We'll,
sure.
we'll see how things play out. Let's talk about law and grace. Christianity differs from Judaism and Islam in this concept of grace. It appears to those of us that are of the Christian faith. While we look at the Old Testament law, and like you mentioned earlier, we all, authoritarian faiths all come back to Abraham, and we all, have this law that was given by God through Moses. We believe that the law demonstrates the justice of God. So an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, this kind of evening of the scale sort of thing. And so we understand justice because of that. But we also believe that Jesus showed us a new and better way when he said, don't resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the cheek, give them the other cheek. If they ask you for your shirt, give them your coat too. If they ask you to go a mile, go 2 miles, right? So that concept of grace is very close to our heart as Christians. How is the concept of grace regarded in the Muslim faith? Is that a concept that you embrace or that exists?
Definitely.
Yeah.
So we have a concept that we call ihsan. Ihsan literally means to make something beautiful.
Okay.
And this is how I would describe grace in our religion. So in our religion, we do have the law. If somebody's harmed, they have the ability to seek justice. But the Quran continuously exhorts people, God's continually exhorting people to forgive and to do ihsan. And ihsan is to go above and beyond, to do something good, even if somebody does something bad to you. So this is the concept that we have. In the Quran, there's a verse that says, idfa billati hiya ahsanu sayyi'ah. They respond to what is evil with something that is beautiful. With this concept of grace or ihsan.
Yeah.
And then God says, and if you do so, you'll see that even your most ardent enemy will become your most devoted friend. And then God says in the next verse, and nobody will achieve this except those who have acquired a great treasure. Meaning that this is a very high level of faith, and the person is able to respond with this grace or with this beauty to people, even if that person does something evil to them. So it's considered the highest form of faith. If something bad happens to you, you're obligated to have patience. You can't respond in ways that are unethical and unmoral. You have to have patience.
Okay.
If you want it to get even better than the bare minimum, you forgive the person.
Okay.
If you want to get even better than that, then you do what is considered ihsan or grace, that you treat the person even better than how they treated you.
Okay.
And the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he described this concept, he said, ihsan, this act of beauty, is to worship God as though you can see him, even though you cannot see him, but he can see you. And so it's kind of living in the divine presence.
Okay. As a Muslim, what must one do to be right with Allah and assured of heaven? Because this is probably right where we're
It's
going.
all connected.
Yeah.
Because I know there's a follow-up to this, I'm going to answer this really concisely.
Okay.
I would say the way for a Muslim to be right with God is to be truthful to God.
Okay.
If you're truthful to God in your beliefs and in your deeds, no matter how many those deeds are, but if you're truthful to God, then God will be truthful to you. And God says in the Quran, that this is a day, the day of resurrection, is a day when those who are truthful will be benefited by their truthfulness.
Okay.
So if you're truthful to God, then that's the way to be right with God.
So can you have confidence and assurance that you are right with God and that you are right with Allah?
So
that you will go to heaven?
So because we hold out that God is the ultimate judge, we don't ascribe purity to anyone over God. God is the one who decides. So we toil ourselves to earn his pleasure, but we know that it's all in the hands of God. So these are the kind of things that we remain silent about.
Okay. The Apostle Paul taught in Romans 3, he says, "For we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law." So we're coming back to that topic. In other words, in the Christian faith, salvation is a free gift that inspires devotion toward God, as opposed to us trying to earn a reward from God. How does that compare to the teaching of Islam?
So we have a similar belief.
Okay.
The Prophet, peace be upon him, told a story about a man in the past, so a follower of Moses or Jesus or someone, who lived by himself and worshipped God for 60 years. So 60 years, every day he's waking up, he's worshiping God, goes sleep, so worship God 60 years. Then he dies, and God will resurrect him and tell him, enter into paradise by my mercy. So he responds to God and says, no, I want to enter by my actions because I've been worshiping you every day for 60 years.
Right.
I want to enter by these actions. So God brings a scale, and they put on one side of the scale 60 years of worship, and on the other side of the scale, he puts the blessing of eyesight. So not the blessing of hearing or smell or anything else that he has in life, just the eyesight. And the blessing of eyesight overwhelms 60 years of worship.
Okay.
So when he sees this, the man says, no, God, let me enter by your mercy, by your mercy. So he enters paradise by his mercy. So we would say that there is no amount of deeds that we can do that can get us salvation. So we agree with you on this part.
Okay.
But rather, we strive to achieve the pleasure of God, and God will enter us, when he enters us into his mercy, then he rewards us far greater than what we deserve.
Okay. And you never ascribe righteousness or unrighteousness to somebody. That's God's.
Exactly. That's
Can you have the peace and assurance in your own heart that you know that you're going to be in heaven with Allah someday?
So, the prophet said, and these are general words, anybody who believes in God in the last day will enter paradise. So things like that. So we know if we maintain our belief in God in the final day, that we will enter paradise, but we can't say my belief is the true belief, because only God knows, right?
One last question. How can we Christians be a blessing to you and to the Muslim community? Are there ways that we can work together on certain things? It's something that we think about a lot, and we know that there are certain distinctions between our faiths that we're probably going to hinder certain things of working together. But as we've already said, people of the book, we have common beliefs in certain things and values. Are there ways that we can work together?
Absolutely. I mean, you inviting me here, this is amazing, because I do feel like there's this barrier. We live in the same country, we're neighbors to each other, and somehow people have very different perceptions of one another. I think the most important thing is we need to be peacemakers. I know being a peacemaker is very important in the Christian tradition. This world is, like we spoke before, how the Muslim world, the average person in the Muslim world, has this very different idea, getting very different information than people in the West and vice versa, and it's kind of creating this divide. We need to be peacemakers and starting in our own communities by reaching out to each other, clarifying some of these misconceptions. I know a lot of Muslims in Canada and the United States really feel these days, especially with the political discourse, that they're being dehumanized. And so even just reaching out and saying, hey, maybe I don't agree with you, we have different conceptions of God and different conceptions of religion, but you know what? You're a human, and I view you as a human, and I have respect for you. That would go a huge way to helping our community. I think also, you're not going to believe in what I believe, I'm not going to believe in what you believe, but we have a shared religious motivation to do good. And this is a society now, you see like kind of the new atheist movements, people like Sam Harris and things like that. They really want to show major religions like Christianity and Islam to seem backwards and outdated, and kind of tell society that we got to kind of discard religion, leave it alone.
And they're pretty militant about it.
They are. So I think we have an obligation to partner together, help feed the poor, help, support refugees, help do this, help do that, because we can show society that our religions can be a source of vibrant good in the world. And honestly, I have respect for people who are religious, regardless of their religion, because I know that it takes devotion and it takes a certain amount of sincerity. So we really can be a source of vibrant good in the society, and I think we need to always look for ways to cooperate. And in the Quran, God says, cooperate with everyone in piety and in righteousness. So whatever we see as righteousness, we need to cooperate with others.
I would agree. Well, Ibrahim, thank you very much. I mentioned to you when I met you at McDonald's, it's encouraging to see a young guy who is not just kind of chasing after all the materialism. You care about things that are very meaningful, and even though we're going to disagree on some things, I really appreciate your willingness to do this and your time. You're very well spoken, and thank you very much.
Thank you.